be able to listen to you interacting in that game and having that interaction with the software. That, I mean, I never download. I should have downloaded it to try it because it's not there anymore. But
No, unfortunately not. And every game that they
that's
did, the
weird.
sad thing is, every
Yeah.
game that they did, like they just got better and better. I mean, by the time they
Hmm.
got to their last game, Audio Defense, I mean, that was an amazing game.
I see. Well, so, and how do you suppose that worked? Did the company simply go under? Were there other things going on? What do you think?
Um, I don't want to really I don't really want to say too much because I'm not entirely sure. I know it was like it was something else games, and it was a I forget what it was, like a sub company under another company, and they just decided to close that branch of it, I think, because it just wasn't really making that much of profit for them, or they just really wasn't doing well compared to what they wanted, I think, is what ultimately happened.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, because that was a fascinating one. There was another one where there was a game, and I forget what it was called. The game where it was like a medieval story, and you had like three different paths to go on in the story. Something about that with a lot of you recorded it years ago. It was a lot of very dramatic voice acting, a lot of overly dramatic voice acting. And it
I'm
was like
not
it
sure.
was like a medieval setting, and
Yeah, was it an audio game or was it actually
yeah,
a mainstream game?
no, it was an audio.
Could have been a Blind Legend.
Yeah, could have been. There was a lot of interesting. Okay, so now I mean the other thing that really is impressive is the Oculus Rift and this whole concept of virtual reality. You played one game. Well, you've done playthroughs of a lot of the Oculus Rift content, but two that really stood out to me were the one where it's like an Arctic scene where you're kind of like in like you're like surviving in like the wilderness. That one. And then there was another one where you were like in an ocean. You were like a diver in the ocean, and you had to like swim about in the ocean or something like that. Do you remember which ones I'm talking about for those?
There's been a couple that have had some. There's been a couple that have had some snowy areas and that have had some underwater things. Like I
Hmm.
said, there's I've just done so many. It's kind of funny, but yeah, VR is a really interesting thing. And the way that I do a lot of these spotlight videos, be it low vision or accessible or VR spotlights, I've kind of drawn a lot of inspiration. I was trying to figure out also how I wanted to do my video content, and I
Right.
didn't
So
really want to do a lot of like really scripted things because I
yeah,
don't want to be like a scripted review going, I like this game, their graphics are really good, da da da. It just they're
that's
boring, and
boring.
so
So
I
yeah, I
drew a
mean,
lot.
people
I
and people have been funny about that with me. Even on the podcasting side, people have been funny about that. So someone, I was looking at one point, I was looking for topics for a podcast, and someone had to be funny, and they had to say, well, why don't you talk about why don't you do a podcast where you talk about the process that you go through to talk about in a podcast? So it
mhm.
can be really hard to talk. It can be hard to decide. How do you decide what gets covered? Yeah.
Oh, exactly. And so what I did is I actually drew a lot of inspiration. There's a gaming site that kind of splintered away from GameSpot back in the day, but there's a site called Giant Bomb, and they have these videos called quick looks where they just basically turn on the camera, start a game, they talk over it, they play it a little bit, and they just kind of let you decide. They give their own opinions, but they let the viewer decide, is like, well, if things go really well, great. If things go really badly or in between, you kind of get an idea of, and they cover games where like not all, they don't like all of them. It's like sometimes you really want to like a game and it doesn't turn out very well, or sometimes you discover a hidden gem or whatever. But that's kind of the inspiration that I took when I do my video, the way that I do a lot of my videos. And also, I don't really know a heck of a lot about video editing, so laziness prevails.
Exactly. Yeah. I think for me with the podcasting, what got me into it was that I felt in a sort of a similar way that you do, that I felt that there was sort of a void, sort of a big space in the podcast world where other blind people needed a podcast that was approachable. And then ironically, I saw opportunities, and then, from there the podcast took off. But I've had to do a lot of monologues before I've gotten the opportunity to talk to a lot of guests. So I mean, that's one thing. Have you considered podcasting, to do like a spotlight podcast where you just talk about the game in a podcast sense?
Well, I have been doing a podcast a little bit off and on. We've had some technical difficulties, and then just some other stuff kind of went down. But like I have been doing a podcast for a little bit, about a year-ish now. The A4G podcast.
Oh,
So yeah,
great.
I've done a little bit of that. I'm not quite sure. It's sort of kind of in hiatus at the moment, but yeah, so I have been doing that, and I do find that I do enjoy just chatting with other people, be it on their podcast or something of my own. So yeah, I mean, I do genuinely like talking with others because I do a lot of monologuing myself as well.
Hmm. Well, good. So, what was so what did you cover on your podcast? Is it just accessibility, or did you do monologues about blindness issues? What did you cover?
Well, it was a couple of us, and we basically would talk about. It was mainly a game accessibility podcast. We would try to cover either different, a little bit of different topics that were coming out, either accessible games or topics in that area, or a little bit of tech in general, a little bit of what we were playing. We're just kind of trying a few different things and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Excellent. Great. Great. And what are I mean, it's a little hard with the current circumstances and current situation, but I guess the other interesting topic is to think about when things get all the way back to normal. Where would you like to go? What are some goals that you have? What are some future predictions that you have for future games that we will see?
Well, interesting that you mentioned that because, again, in the last couple of years, but especially in the last several months, there's been a lot of stuff going on. Like, honestly, some of this tech and game accessibility stuff this year that's been happening so far is kind of been really nice because, for a lot of people, 2020 has kind of been not the most pleasant year ever. And so having just some of these bright spots of like seeing what's happening in game accessibility has kind of kept me sane. Um, and yeah, there's a lot of things happening right now. There are several games that I've been looking at recently, and the trend that I'm liking is a lot more. We have games that are developed specifically for blind players, but a lot of these are really small companies or developers, and it's hard to kind of find a big audience because a lot of mainstream audience maybe would just kind of treat that as like a novelty and wouldn't necessarily buy into it. So you end up seeing a lot of these companies either going under or just kind of stopping development after a while, which is sad. But what we're starting to see more is more mainstream companies, your big ones, Microsoft, EA, Ubisoft, just to name a few. Naughty Dog, I have to mention that one because these mainstream games are like, indie developers, AAA developers, they're actually starting to add more accessibility to their games. And, some of it, not just for blind, low vision, but, mobility impairment, hearing impairment, vision impairment. And we're starting to see, for blind and visually impaired specifically, we're starting to see a little bit more like text to speech support for menus and user interfaces. And even during gameplay, we're starting to see a couple titles do that. There's a game coming out in about 2 weeks for the PlayStation 4 called The Last of Us 2, The Last of Us Part 2. I played the first one, It was amazing. It was awesome, but it really didn't have many accessibility features in it at all, really any at all that I remember of. But there was an announcement early last week. Like, I was looking forward to the game in general just because I could play it and I want to see where the story goes. But then last week, there was this announcement that they did this article on TheVerge.com where they said, yeah, by the way, we're serious about accessibility. They did Uncharted 4 a couple of years ago, and they're moving on from that. So The Last of Us Part 2 is actually having 60 plus accessibility features built in. And they also said that a totally blind player should be able to play this game start to finish.
And what is the premise of this game?
So the premise is, I don't really know what's going to happen in the second one, but the first one, there's this sort of weird, it's kind of a weird thing that is coming out right now, because the premise of the first one is that, like, there's this weird, I forget what it is. It's like this kind of virus thing that kind of mutates people, and it gets spread through these spores in the air. And so there's like these infected individuals, but you get these, it's kind of like this almost like apocalyptic sort of a thing that happens. And so you get these bands of people that are around, and you find out, like, you play this Joel character and you're escorting this Ellie person to this group of people because theoretically she's immune to the virus and maybe she can be used as a cure. Well, a bunch of bad things happen along the way. And the ending of that game is really interesting. And it kind of picks up so part 2 picks up about 5 years later, and it's just so it picks up, and this time you get to play as Ellie throughout the story. You're not playing as Joel. So it is like a third person action kind of a game. You have stealth and shooting and a bunch of story. I mean, it is really grim in a way, but it's still really well done.
Well, that sounds extremely interesting. Yeah, it sounds like it's one of these it's a game that just features a single player campaign.
Correct.
It's not really multiplayer. Yeah. Well, that is interesting. We are sneaking up on a break, about 2.5 minutes. By the
Mm-hmm.
way, by the way, listener, my name's Aaron Richmond, and this is the Aaron's Opinion podcast on 87.1 Caroline Radio and Blind Advocate Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts, or YouTube, or anywhere else these days. And we're joined by Jessie Anderson, although if you have been following him on YouTube, you probably thought his name was illegally cited, because more commonly you're known as illegally cited in the YouTube
Yep.
in the YouTube community. Yeah, that's about as good of a username as you could come up with.
I got to admit, it grew on me once I decided to go with it. It's definitely grown on me over the years. I've really become fond of it, to be honest.
Well, that's interesting, extremely. And so I recall that you are from Minnesota. I've never been to your state. Why don't you tell our listeners, maybe give our listeners a little bit of information about what it's like, having nothing to do with the game accessibility, but maybe
Sure.
if you think Minnesota is just a good state for blind people, what have you found about that?
Well, I actually grew up in North Dakota, but then I've moved around a few different places. So I've lived in North Dakota. I've been in Minnesota for the past little over 10 years. I lived here for a few years before that when I was in college. I lived in Florida for about 3.5 years because I was going for a specific job. It's like, hey, you got to go where the jobs are. So I moved to Florida for 3.5 years. But yeah, Minnesota, it is a nice place to live. I live in St. Paul, so it is it's a big metro area. So there's a lot of different things as far as public transportation goes. You got the bus system, you have the light rail. There is a separate state agency, like I said, State Services for the Blind, because I work there. But and then a few years ago when things like Uber and Lyft started becoming a thing, I can't tell you how really useful those types of things have been, just because, like, at any time, if I want to go somewhere, I can just boom, schedule it with my phone.
That's
Hop in
really
a car and just
oh,
go.
that's so good. That's so good.
Yeah.
All right then, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Aaron's Opinion podcast on KCGN.